Have you ever wondered how the first Native Americans got here? The answer starts with an ice age that changed the entire planet. Sea levels dropped 400 feet, exposing a land bridge between Asia and Alaska. People crossed it following herds of animals. Then, the ice age ended, the bridge flooded, and those people were isolated for 10,000 years. This is the story of that crossing and that separation, from the ice age that made it possible to the warming that ended it. The story begins about 100,000 years ago, when Earth's climate entered a period we call the last glacial period. The planet had experienced many ice ages before this one, cycling between cold and warm periods over millions of years. But this particular ice age would set the stage for one of the most important migrations in human history. What triggers an ice age? The answer lies in Earth's orbital variations, patterns discovered by Serbian scientist Milankovitch in the early 20th century. Earth's orbit around the Sun isn't perfectly circular. It changes shape over about 100,000 years. The tilt of Earth's axis also varies over 41,000 years, wobbling between about 22 and 24.5 degrees. When these orbital variations align in specific ways, the northern hemisphere receives less sunlight during summer months. This is the critical factor. When summer temperatures drop just a few degrees, snow that accumulated during winter doesn't fully melt. Year after year, the snow builds up. The weight of new snow compresses the old snow underneath. Over decades and centuries, this compressed snow transforms into glacial ice. Ice sheets begin forming where conditions favor accumulation. The Laurentide ice sheet starts growing in eastern Canada. The Cordilleran ice sheet develops along the mountain ranges of western Canada. These aren't just thick layers of ice. They are flowing rivers of ice, moving under their own immense weight. The growth accelerates because of a feedback loop. Ice and snow are white, reflecting sunlight back into space rather than absorbing it. This reflection means less heat is absorbed by Earth's surface. The planet cools further. More snow falls and persists. More ice forms. The cooling reinforces itself in a runaway process. At the peak around 20,000 years ago, the ice sheets reached their maximum extent. The Laurentide ice sheet covered almost all of Canada and extended south into what is now the northern United States. In some places, the ice was more than 2 miles thick. Imagine standing at the base and looking up at ice rising higher than 5 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. Where does all this water come from? The oceans. Water evaporates from the ocean surface as it always does. The water vapor rises, forms clouds, and moves over land. But instead of falling as rain that flows back to the ocean, it falls as snow. The snow accumulates and transforms into ice. The ice doesn't return to the ocean, except at the very slow rate that glaciers flow toward the sea. This one-way transfer of water from ocean to land has a dramatic effect. Sea levels begin dropping. The process is gradual, perhaps a few inches per year, but it continues for thousands of years. By 20,000 years ago, the sea levels had dropped approximately 400 feet below where they are today. To put this in perspective, a 40-story building is roughly 400 feet tall. This sea level drop transformed the world's geography. The continental shelves, which are normally shallow underwater platforms extending from the continents, became exposed land. In some places, the shelf extends for hundreds of miles from the current coastline. When sea levels dropped 400 feet, all of this shelf area became dry land. The English Channel between Britain and France disappeared. The Persian Gulf was mostly dry land. Indonesia's islands were connected to mainland Asia. The coastline of every continent extended miles beyond its current position. In one particular location, this sea level drop had consequences that would change human history. The Bering Strait, the narrow passage that currently separates Asia from North America, is remarkably shallow. The average depth is only about 160 feet. Most of it is much shallower than that. When sea levels dropped 200 feet, the Bering Strait became dry land. When sea levels dropped 400 feet, the entire region transformed into a broad plain, extending hundreds of miles in every direction. This exposed land wasn't just a narrow bridge. It was a subcontinent roughly the size of Texas and California combined. Scientists call this landmass Beringia. The exposure of Beringia didn't happen suddenly. Sea levels dropped gradually over thousands of years as the ice sheets grew. Beringia first emerged above water around 35,000 years ago. The land connection between Asia and North America remained open for approximately 24,000 years, finally flooding again around 11,000 years ago. The climate across the world was dramatically different during the Ice Age maximum. Global average temperatures were approximately 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit colder than today. Northern regions experienced much more severe cooling than tropical areas. In North America, ice covered everything north of what is now the Great Lakes region and New York City. The ice sheets weren't the only dramatic change. With so much water locked up in ice, global precipitation patterns shifted. Many areas became drier. The interior of continents became extremely arid, but the ice sheets created their own weather systems. Now, with cold air, masses flowing off the ice and affecting climate across the hemisphere. The vegetation patterns changed to match the climate. Forests retreated toward the equator. The areas just south of the ice sheets, which are now temperate forests, were cold grasslands called steppe tundra. This ecosystem was similar to modern Arctic tundra in temperature, but more productive because it received more sunlight during summer. These steppe tundra grasslands supported enormous populations of large grazing animals. This was the age of megafauna, when massive Ice Age mammals dominated the landscape. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, and many other species thrived in Ice Age ecosystems. The megafauna weren't just impressive in diversity, they were impressive in size. Now, the short-faced bear stood 12 feet tall on its hind legs and weighed up to 1,500 pounds. The Columbian mammoth stood 13 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed up to 10 tons. Giant ground sloths could weigh 4 tons. These animals required enormous amounts of food, which means the Ice Age ecosystems must have been highly productive despite the cold. The steppe tundra was rich grassland, supporting dense populations of herbivores, which in turn supported healthy populations of predators. The biomass of large mammals during the Ice Age may have exceeded anything we see in modern ecosystems. The world was full, wild, and dangerous in ways that are hard to imagine today. Every large predator we have now is a diminished version of its Ice Age ancestor. Modern brown bears are smaller than short-faced bears. Modern wolves are smaller than dire wolves. The Ice Age was the peak of mammalian megafauna. But the Ice Age world wasn't static. Climate fluctuated even within the overall cold period. There were phases of intense cold punctuated by brief, warmer intervals. During the coldest phases, ice sheets expanded further. During warmer intervals, they retreated somewhat. These fluctuations meant that coastlines and animal distributions were constantly shifting. This was the world that humans lived in during the late Ice Age. Small bands of hunter-gatherers spread across the ice, free portions of the continents, following herds of animals, adapting to harsh climates, developing increasingly sophisticated technologies for survival. They had no agriculture, no permanent settlements, but they had intelligence, cooperation, and accumulated knowledge. Crucially, some human groups had moved into northeastern Asia by at least 30,000 years ago. The archaeological site of Yana in northern Siberia shows human occupation from 32,000 years ago. People at this site were making stone tools, working ivory, hunting woolly rhinoceros, and surviving temperatures that regularly dropped below -50 degrees Fahrenheit. These Siberian populations had mastered cold climate survival. They knew how to make warm clothing from animal hides. They knew how to build shelters that could withstand extreme cold. They knew how to hunt megafauna in harsh conditions. They possessed all the skills necessary to survive in the most challenging environments on Earth. When Beringia emerged as dry land, connecting Asia to Alaska, these humans were perfectly positioned to cross. They didn't know they were standing at the threshold of populating two continents. They were just following the herds, doing what their ancestors had done for hundreds of thousands of years. The stage was set for one of the most consequential migrations in human history. The Bering Strait today is a narrow passage of water separating the easternmost point of Russia from the westernmost point of Alaska. The distance across is only about 55 miles at the narrowest point. On a clear day, you can stand on one side and see the other continent across the water. What makes the Bering Strait significant for our story is its depth, or rather, its lack of depth. The strait is remarkably shallow. The average depth is only about 160 feet. Most of the seafloor in this region sits at depths between 100 and 200 feet below the current sea level. There are no deep ocean trenches here. This shallowness exists because the Bering Strait sits on what geologists call the Bering Platform, a broad area of continental crust that connects the Siberian and Alaskan landmasses at depth. During the Ice Age, when sea levels dropped 400 feet, this entire platform became exposed land. The landmass that emerged wasn't a narrow bridge. That term gives the wrong impression. Beringia, at its maximum extent, was a subcontinent measuring roughly 1,000 miles from north to south and 600 miles from east to west at its widest point. The total area was approximately 1 million square miles, larger than Alaska and Texas combined. Beringia existed as exposed land from approximately 35,000 years ago until about 11,000 years ago. For most of this 24,000-year period, you could walk from Siberia to Alaska without ever seeing the ocean. The journey would take weeks, crossing hundreds of miles of open terrain, but there would be no water barrier. Understanding what Beringia actually looked like is crucial to understanding how humans crossed it. For many years, popular imagination depicted Beringia as a frozen wasteland, a nightmarish landscape of howling winds and brutal cold. This image appears in movies and documentaries. It's dramatic and memorable. It's also wrong. Beringia was cold, certainly. Winter temperatures regularly dropped well below 0 Fahrenheit, but it wasn't covered in glacial ice. The reason has to do with precipitation patterns. Glaciers form where heavy snowfall accumulates faster than it can melt. Beringia was too dry for glaciers to form. The region sat in a continental interior climate far from major moisture sources. The Pacific Ocean to the south was cold, and its weather systems typically tracked further south. The Arctic Ocean to the north was frozen and contributed little moisture. The result was a cold, dry climate with relatively light snowfall. Without heavy snowfall, glaciers couldn't form. Beringia remained ice-free even while massive glaciers covered regions to the east in Alaska and to the west in Siberia. The landscape was open, accessible, and capable of supporting life. Scientists classify the Beringia ecosystem as steppe tundra. Steppe tundra was a unique ecosystem that no longer exists in quite the same form anywhere on Earth today. It combined cold temperatures with enough summer sunlight at high latitudes to support substantial plant growth during the brief warm season. The vegetation consisted primarily of grasses, sedges, and herbaceous plants adapted to cold and wind. During summer, the grass could grow thick enough to wave in the wind, creating a golden sea of vegetation stretching to the horizon. Wildflowers bloomed during the peak of summer, taking advantage of the 24-hour daylight at high latitudes. Shrubby vegetation grew in protected areas and along waterways. The soil in many areas remained permanently frozen below the surface, a condition called permafrost. During summer, the top layer would thaw, creating a waterlogged surface, and this prevented water from draining downward, creating numerous shallow ponds and marshy areas across the landscape. These wetlands were highly productive despite the cold climate. The most important aspect of Beringia was its ability to support large mammals. The steppe tundra grasslands provided grazing for enormous herds of herbivores. These weren't small animals struggling to survive. They were megafauna, the giants of the Ice Age, living in populations that may have rivaled the great herds of the African savanna. Woolly mammoths were the iconic species of Beringia. Adults stood about 9 to 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed 5 to 6 tons. Their distinctive, long, curved tusks could reach 13 feet in length. They had a layer of fat up to 4 inches thick under their skin for insulation. Yet their hair grew in 2 layers, with long guard hairs covering dense wool underneath. Mammoths were grazers, using their trunks to sweep snow aside and expose grass underneath. Studies of frozen mammoth stomach contents show they ate primarily grass and sedges. An adult mammoth needed roughly 400 pounds of vegetation per day. The fact that Beringia supported large mammoth populations proves the landscape was productive. Steppe bison were another dominant herbivore on Beringia. These were larger than modern bison, with bulls weighing up to 2,500 pounds. Their horns spanned up to 7 feet from tip to tip. They traveled in herds that could number in the hundreds or thousands, migrating seasonally to follow the best grazing. Horses lived on Beringia in multiple species. These weren't the horses we know today. They were stockier, with shorter legs and thicker builds, adapted for cold climate survival. They grazed alongside the bison and mammoths, forming mixed herds in some areas. The horses were numerous enough that their bones are commonly found in Ice Age deposits. Perhaps surprisingly, camels lived on Ice Age Beringia. The camel family actually originated in North America tens of millions of years ago. During the Ice Age, several camel species still lived in North America. The western camel and yesterday's camel inhabited Beringia and the ice-free regions to the south. Caribou were present in large numbers. These animals are superbly adapted to Arctic and subarctic conditions. They migrate long distances seasonally, following the plant growth. Their populations may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands across Beringia, providing a reliable food source for predators, including humans. Musk oxen, with their long, shaggy coats and curved horns, were another cold-adapted herbivore. These animals have the warmest coat of any mammal, capable of withstanding temperatures of 60 below zero Fahrenheit. They lived in small herds and used a defensive formation when threatened. The herbivore populations supported a community of predators. Short-faced bears were the apex predators of Beringia. These massive bears stood 12 feet tall on their hind legs and weighed up to 1,500 pounds. They had long legs built for running. Their jaws and teeth were adapted for crushing bone. Dire wolves were larger and more robust than modern gray wolves. They had bigger heads, stronger jaws, and more powerful builds. Fossil evidence suggests they hunted in packs like modern wolves, using cooperation to bring down prey much larger than themselves. Cave lions, also called American lions, were larger than modern African lions. Males may have weighed up to 800 pounds. Unlike modern lions, they likely didn't have manes, an adaptation that makes sense in cold climates. They were solitary hunters rather than pride hunters. Scimitar cats, with their elongated serrated canine teeth, were pursuit predators built for running down prey in open country. They were lighter and faster than the more famous saber-toothed cats that lived further south. Their teeth were designed to slash and bleed prey. The predator-prey balance on Beringia represented a functioning ecosystem as complex as any modern ecosystem. The herbivores grazed the grasslands. The predators controlled herbivore populations. Scavengers cleaned up carcasses. The ecosystem recycled nutrients efficiently, maintaining productivity despite the cold climate. Beringia wasn't a uniform landscape. River valleys cut through the plains, providing different habitats. Hills and ridges broke up the flat expanses. Coastlines provided marine resources. Lakes and ponds dotted the interior. This habitat diversity supported a diversity of species beyond just the megafauna. Smaller mammals included ground squirrels, Arctic hares, lemmings, and voles. These small herbivores were crucial parts of the ecosystem, serving as prey for smaller predators like Arctic foxes and wolverines. Birds included ptarmigan, snowy owls, ravens, and during summer, vast numbers of migrating waterfowl. And this was the landscape that humans encountered when they reached Beringia. It wasn't empty wasteland. It was a rich hunting ground full of game animals. The mammoths, horses, and bison had never encountered humans before. They had no evolved fear response to human hunters. This made them vulnerable in ways that would have profound consequences. The climate of Beringia, while cold, was survivable for humans with appropriate technology. People would need warm clothing made from animal hides and furs. They would need shelter from wind and cold. They would need fire for warmth and cooking. But these were technologies that human groups in cold regions of Asia had already developed. Beringia wasn't a barrier to be crossed with difficulty and danger. It was habitable land, an extension of the territory that Asian hunter-gatherer groups already occupied. When sea levels dropped and Beringia emerged, it simply became part of the landscape. There was no dramatic moment of decision to cross to a new world. There was only the gradual expansion of human groups into newly available territory, following the herds they had always followed. Human groups had been living in northeastern Asia for tens of thousands of years before Beringia became fully exposed. Archaeological evidence shows that modern humans reached Siberia by at least 40,000 years ago. These weren't primitive wanderers. They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers with technologies specifically adapted for survival in cold climates. The archaeological site of Yana in northern Siberia provides evidence of human occupation from 32,000 years ago. People at this site were making stone tools, working ivory, hunting woolly rhinoceros and other megafauna, and surviving temperatures that regularly dropped below -50 degrees Fahrenheit. They had mastered cold climate survival long before anyone crossed into the Americas. These Siberian populations weren't static. Hunter-gatherer groups move regularly, following animal migrations, seeking new hunting grounds, avoiding resource depletion. Movement is normal for this way of life. When Beringia emerged as the Ice Age intensified and sea levels dropped, it simply became new territory to explore and exploit. The timing of the first human entry into Beringia is difficult to pinpoint precisely because much of the evidence is now underwater. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, the central portions of Beringia were flooded. Any archaeological sites in those areas are now beneath 200 feet of water in the Bering Sea. The earliest widely accepted evidence for humans in Alaska comes from sites dating to around 15,000 years ago. However, some researchers argue for earlier dates. The Bluefish caves in Yukon Territory have produced animal bones with cut marks that might indicate human activity around 24,000 years ago, though this interpretation is debated. What seems clear is that humans were present in eastern Beringia, the portion that is now Alaska, and by at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly significantly earlier. These people brought with them a toolkit adapted for Ice Age hunting. Their stone tools show technological sophistication developed over millennia in Asia. The population that crossed into Alaska wasn't large. Genetic studies of modern Native Americans provide insights into the size of the founding population. By analyzing genetic diversity and using models of population genetics, researchers can work backward to estimate how many people gave rise to all subsequent Native American populations. Recent studies suggest a founding population of approximately 200 to 500 individuals. This represents perhaps 10 to 20 bands of typical hunter-gatherer size. These bands wouldn't all have crossed at the same time or even been in direct contact with each other. They represent the total effective breeding population that contributed genes to later Native Americans. This small founding population had major genetic consequences. When a small group splits off from a larger population and becomes isolated, they carry only a subset of the original population's genetic diversity. This process is called a genetic bottleneck or founder effect. The founding population crossing into Alaska experienced a severe bottleneck. They carried only a fraction of the genetic diversity present in Asian populations. Every Native American who descended from them inherited this reduced diversity. Modern genetic studies show that Native American populations have lower genetic diversity than African, European, or Asian populations. The bottleneck shows up in multiple genetic markers. Mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only through the mother's line, shows that Native Americans belong primarily to 5 haplogroups labeled A, B, C, D, and X. These haplogroups all trace back to East Asian ancestry, but the limited number reflects the small founding population. Y chromosome analysis, which traces the father's line, shows a similar pattern. Native American Y chromosomes belong to a limited number of haplogroups, all with East Asian origins. The genetic signatures consistently point to a small founding population with roots in northeastern Asia, experiencing a bottleneck as they entered the Americas. Genetic evidence also reveals that the founding population didn't enter the Americas in a single wave. Instead, there were at least 3 major genetic pulses. The first and largest gave rise to most Native American populations from Canada to South America. The second contributed to some northern groups. The third, much later, gave rise to Inuit and Aleut populations. These multiple waves make sense, given that Beringia existed for 24,000 years. There was ample time for different groups at different times to move from Asia through Beringia into Alaska. The groups may have been separated by thousands of years. They weren't part of a coordinated migration. Once human groups reached Alaska, they faced a major geographical obstacle. Ice sheets covered most of Canada. The Laurentide ice sheet extended from the Atlantic coast westward to the Rocky Mountains. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered the coastal mountains and extended inland. At their maximum, these ice sheets merged, creating a continuous wall of ice. How did people get past this ice barrier? This question has generated intense debate among archaeologists for decades. 2 main routes have been proposed, each with different implications for the timing and nature of human migration. The evidence for each route has shifted as new discoveries are made. The first proposed route is the ice-free corridor. This corridor was a narrow strip of land between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. The corridor ran roughly north to south through what is now Alberta and eastern British Columbia. When the 2 ice sheets weren't fully merged, this corridor potentially provided a path south. The ice-free corridor was proposed as the migration route in the mid-20th century and became the standard explanation in textbooks. The logic seemed sound. The corridor existed between the ice sheets. People could have walked through it. It led directly from Beringia to the Great Plains where early sites were being discovered. However, more recent research has complicated this picture significantly. Geological studies show that the corridor wasn't continuously open throughout the Ice Age. The 2 ice sheets merged during the coldest periods, completely closing the corridor. When the corridor was open, the timing and conditions matter greatly. Studies using ice core data and glacial geology suggest the corridor may not have opened until around 13,000 years ago or possibly slightly earlier. This timing is problematic because archaeological evidence now shows humans were already south of the ice sheets by at least 14,500 years ago. Furthermore, when the corridor first opened, it may not have been immediately habitable. The newly deglaciated landscape would have been barren at first. Vegetation would have taken time to colonize the bare ground. Game animals would have followed only after vegetation was established. Some researchers estimate it might have taken several hundred to 1,000 years for the corridor to develop sufficient resources. The alternative is the coastal route along the Pacific coast. This route would have followed the coastline from Beringia southward, along what is now coastal Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. Even during the Ice Age maximum, portions of the Pacific coast remained ice-free. The coastal route had significant advantages. Marine environments are highly productive. Fish, shellfish, seabirds, seals, and sea otters would have provided abundant food resources. Kelp forests along the coast create rich ecosystems teeming with life. The climate along the coast is moderated by the ocean, making it less extreme than interior regions. This hypothesis is sometimes called the kelp highway, because giant kelp forests would have provided a consistent habitat and food source along the entire route. Kelp forests grow in cold coastal waters from Alaska to Southern California and beyond. They support dense populations of fish and invertebrates. The major challenge with the coastal route hypothesis has been finding evidence. Yet sea levels were 400 feet lower during the Ice Age, which means the coastline was miles further out than today's coast. When sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, the rising ocean flooded the coastal plain where people would have been living. Despite this challenge, some evidence for the coastal route has emerged. Archaeological sites in coastal California show human presence by 13,000 years ago. The Monte Verde site in southern Chile, dating to 14,500 years ago, contains remains of seaweed along with stone tools and evidence of residential structures. More recently, researchers have examined coastal cave sites that remained above water even as sea levels rose. Several caves in coastal Alaska and British Columbia have produced evidence of human occupation starting around 13,000 years ago, with some potentially older dates under investigation. Genetic evidence also supports the coastal migration route. Studies of Native American populations show genetic signatures consistent with a rapid coastal migration followed by expansion inland. The genetic diversity patterns match what would be expected from groups moving quickly along a productive coastal corridor. The current scientific consensus is leaning toward the coastal route as the primary pathway for the initial peopling of the Americas, with the ice-free corridor potentially becoming available later as an additional route. However, this is an active area of research, and our understanding continues to evolve. Regardless of which route people took, the expansion through the Americas once they were south of the ice sheets was remarkably rapid. Archaeological sites show human presence in Monte Verde in Chile by 14,500 years ago. By 13,000 years ago, people had reached the southern tip of South America. This represents a migration from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego in perhaps 2,000 years or less. From the Bering Strait to the southern tip of South America is roughly 10,000 miles. Covering this distance in 2,000 years means an average expansion rate of 5 miles per year. Why did people move so quickly? The most likely explanation is that they were entering a landscape with no human competition and with game animals that had never encountered human hunters. The megafauna of the Americas had no evolved fear of humans. This made hunting far easier than in Asia, where animals had been hunted by humans for hundreds of thousands of years. Easy hunting meant abundant food. Abundant food meant populations could grow rapidly. As populations grew, groups would split, with some staying in good territory while others moved into new areas. Over generations, this process of population growth and dispersal pushed the frontier of human occupation steadily southward. The archaeological record shows a specific tool technology associated with this expansion. Clovis points appear in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago. These are distinctive stone projectile points, typically 3 to 4 inches long, with a fluted channel running up both sides of the base. The fluting was created by removing a long, thin flake from each face. Clovis points are found across North America, from Alaska to Mexico. The technology spread rapidly, appearing across the continent within a few hundred years. Clovis sites often contain the remains of mammoths and other megafauna, along with the distinctive stone points. By 12,000 years ago, humans had populated both continents. The initial colonization was complete. The Americas had gone from having no human populations to having humans in virtually every habitable environment in perhaps 3,000 years. What did it take to cross Beringia and populate 2 continents? The answer lies in sophisticated technologies and knowledge systems developed over hundreds of thousands of years. The people who made this journey weren't primitive. They possessed skills that most modern people couldn't replicate without years of training. Stone tool technology represents one of the most impressive achievements. Making a functional Clovis point isn't something you can figure out by trial and error in an afternoon. Modern experimental archaeologists who try to replicate these points without training produce crude results even after weeks of practice. The people who crossed into the Americas could produce symmetrical, thin, deadly efficient points consistently. Creating a Clovis point requires understanding how stone fractures. Different stones behave differently when struck. Obsidian is volcanic glass that produces the sharpest possible edge, but is brittle and breaks easily under stress. Flint and chert are more durable and hold an edge well. Quartzite is extremely tough, but harder to shape precisely. The fluting process, creating the channel that runs up both sides of a Clovis point, is particularly difficult. The toolmaker must position the stone precisely and apply pressure at exactly the right angle with exactly the right force. Too little pressure and nothing happens. Too much pressure and the entire point shatters. Success requires understanding the stone's internal structure and grain. Heat treatment adds another layer of sophistication. Certain stones, when heated to specific temperatures, change their internal structure in ways that make them easier to flake and capable of producing sharper edges. This is material science without laboratories. Knowledge gained through experimentation and passed down through generations. Fire creation technology was equally critical. Making fire with a bow drill requires generating approximately 800 degrees Fahrenheit at the friction point through mechanical action. The bow converts linear motion to rotary motion, increasing speed and reducing effort. The drill must be slightly harder than the board, but not so much harder that it won't generate the fine wood dust that forms a coal. The materials must be precisely matched. Different woods have different properties. Cottonwood makes excellent fireboards because it's soft and produces abundant dust. Cedar makes good tinder because it's fibrous and resinous. Knowing which wood to use for which purpose requires botanical knowledge and practical experience. Clothing technology involved sophisticated thermal engineering. The layered system used by Ice Age hunters created airspace between layers for insulation. An inner layer of soft fur sat against the skin. An outer layer of tougher hide broke the wind. Seams were constructed to be waterproof using sinew thread that swells when wet, closing any gaps. Hide processing demonstrates applied chemistry. Brain tanning works because brains contain oils that break down proteins in hide, making it soft and supple. Every animal has enough brains to tan its own hide, a rule that holds true across species. Smoking deposits chemicals that preserve the leather and make it water-resistant. This is chemistry without chemical formulas. Cordage technology shows understanding of structural mechanics. Individual plant fibers are weak, but when twisted together properly, they create rope stronger than the sum of its parts. The twisting puts tension on the fibers that prevents slipping. Different plants produce fibers with different properties. Hemp is strong but stiff. Nettle is flexible but weaker. Knowing which fiber to use for which purpose matters. Navigation required sophisticated spatial reasoning and memory. People maintained mental maps of vast territories covering hundreds of miles. They remembered the locations of water sources, stone quarries, productive plant patches, and reliable hunting areas. They navigated by sun and stars, understanding that certain star patterns remain fixed while others rotate around them. Weather prediction relied on reading atmospheric conditions. Cloud formations indicated approaching storms. Animal behavior provided clues about weather changes. Birds flying low meant storms approaching. Squirrels frantically gathering food meant an early winter. These weren't superstitions. They were observations of real correlations refined over generations. Plant knowledge represented botanical expertise of the highest order. The people who crossed into the Americas could identify hundreds of plant species by sight. They knew which parts of each plant were edible and when. Roots in spring before the plant flowers, seeds in late summer after maturation, leaves of some plants only when young. This knowledge was literally life or death. Many edible plants have toxic look-alikes. The difference might be subtle, leaves slightly more pointed or stems smooth rather than hairy. Mistaking one for the other meant poisoning. The knowledge had to be transmitted accurately and completely to every generation. Animal behavior reading involved interpretation and prediction. Trackers could look at footprints and determine what animal made them, how large it was, how recently it passed, whether it was walking or running, whether it was healthy or injured, whether it was alone or in a group. This is forensic science applied to survival. Understanding animal seasonal patterns and behaviors was essential for hunting success. Deer feed most actively at dawn and dusk. Bison form larger herds in fall during mating season. Mammoth are more dangerous when they have calves in spring. This knowledge let hunters plan their activities for maximum efficiency and minimum risk. Food preservation demonstrates understanding of bacterial growth and prevention. Drying removes the moisture that bacteria need to grow. Smoking deposits antimicrobial compounds. Fat preservation works because bacteria can't grow in pure fat. Pemmican, made by mixing dried meat powder with rendered fat and dried berries, can last indefinitely because bacteria can't access the meat protein through the fat matrix. The sophistication of pemmican technology is remarkable. The ratio of meat to fat matters. Too much meat and it's dry and crumbly. Too much fat and it's greasy and unpalatable. The correct ratio is roughly equal parts by weight. The result is a food that provides 3,000 calories per pound, offers complete nutrition, requires no cooking, and never spoils. Medical knowledge was practical and effective within its limits. People knew that willow bark tea reduced pain and fever. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, though they didn't know the chemistry. They knew that certain fungi prevented wound infections. Yet they had discovered natural antibiotics through observation and experimentation. All of this knowledge existed in human minds without writing, books, or external storage. Everything was remembered, practiced, and passed down through demonstration and repetition. This is humanity's first information technology, cultural transmission through teaching and learning. It worked because people paid attention, because the stakes were ultimate, because failure meant death. The people who crossed Beringia and populated 2 continents possessed this complete knowledge system. It's what made survival possible. It's what made the crossing possible. Without these skills, developed over hundreds of thousands of years, the Americas would have remained empty of humans. Around 14,000 years ago, Earth's climate began to change. The same orbital variations that had triggered the Ice Age were shifting again. Summer sunlight in the northern hemisphere was increasing. The delicate balance that had maintained the ice sheets for tens of thousands of years was tipping in the other direction. The change didn't happen overnight. Climate shifts on geological timescales can be rapid, but rapid in this context means centuries or millennia, not days or years. The warming was gradual at first. Summer temperatures rose by a degree or two. Slightly more snow melted each summer than accumulated each winter. The ice sheets stopped growing and began slowly retreating at their edges. The retreat accelerated through a feedback loop, the reverse of the process that had built the ice sheets. As ice melted, it exposed darker ground underneath. Your dark ground absorbs more sunlight than white ice reflects. The absorbed heat warmed the surrounding area, melting more ice. The process reinforced itself in a runaway warming cycle. At the edges of the ice sheets, the melting was dramatic. In some places, ice retreated dozens of feet per year. Rivers of meltwater carved channels through and under the ice. Where the ice met the ocean, massive icebergs broke off and floated away. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered Canada under miles of ice, was beginning to disintegrate. The meltwater had to go somewhere. Billions upon billions of gallons of water that had been locked in ice for thousands of years were returning to the liquid state. Much of it flowed through rivers into the ocean. Some of it pooled behind ice dams, it forming enormous glacial lakes that dwarfed any lakes existing today. Glacial Lake Agassiz formed in central North America as the Laurentide ice sheet retreated. At its maximum, this lake covered an area larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. The water was held in place by ice dams to the north and east. As long as the ice remained, the lake remained stable. But ice dams don't last forever. When ice dams failed, the results were catastrophic. Glacial Lake Missoula, in what is now Montana, held approximately 500 cubic miles of water behind an ice dam in Idaho. When that dam failed around 15,000 years ago, the entire lake drained in approximately 48 hours. The resulting flood was one of the largest known floods in Earth's history. The Missoula flood carved the channeled scablands of eastern Washington. This a landscape of massive erosion features visible from space. The water flow rate during the peak of the flood exceeded 10 times the combined flow of all rivers on Earth today. Boulders the size of houses were moved dozens of miles. The power involved is almost incomprehensible. Similar megafloods occurred as other ice dams failed. Each drainage event sent massive pulses of fresh water into the oceans. These sudden influxes of cold, fresh water may have temporarily disrupted ocean currents, causing brief climate reversals. The warming trend wasn't smooth. It stuttered and paused, with cold periods interrupting the overall warming. Despite these interruptions, the trend was clear. The ice sheets were melting. As they melted, they returned water to the oceans. Sea levels, which had been 400 feet lower than today at the Ice Age maximum, began to rise. The process was gradual, measured in human lifetimes, perhaps a few inches per year. But it was relentless and irreversible. For Beringia, the rising sea level was a death sentence. The land bridge existed only because sea levels were low enough to expose the shallow bearing platform. As sea levels rose, the ocean began reclaiming this land. The flooding didn't happen uniformly. The lowest areas flooded first, creating islands and channels where continuous land had existed. By 13,000 years ago, Beringia was noticeably smaller than it had been at the Ice Age maximum. The coastlines were retreating inland. Areas that had been prime hunting grounds were becoming tidal flats and shallow seas. So the process continued over the next several thousand years. No single generation of people living on Beringia would have perceived the change as dramatic. The coastline might retreat a few dozen feet per year, imperceptible in daily life. But over a human lifetime of 40 or 50 years, the change would be noticeable. Campsites that were once well inland would be near the new coast. Hunting territories would shrink. By 12,000 years ago, Beringia had been reduced to a narrow isthmus. The subcontinent that had once stretched for 600 miles was now perhaps 100 miles wide at its narrowest point. The land connection between Asia and Alaska still existed, but it was tenuous. Around 11,500 years ago, the critical threshold was reached. Sea levels had risen enough that salt water began flowing through the Bering Strait. At first, it may have been seasonal, with the strait flooding during high tides and draining during low tides, but the trend was irreversible. By 11,000 years ago, the Bering Strait was definitively open. The Pacific Ocean and the Arctic Ocean were connected by a navigable channel. Ships could have sailed from one ocean to the other, though no ships existed at that time. The land bridge was severed. Beringia as a continuous landmass ceased to exist. The flooding continued as sea levels kept rising. By 10,000 years ago, the Bering Strait looked much as it does today. The channel was 55 miles wide and 160 feet deep on average. More than 600 miles of land that had connected Asia to Alaska was now underwater. This submerged land is still there, now forming the continental shelf beneath the Bering Sea. Fishing boats today trawl nets across what was once dry land where mammoths grazed and humans hunted. Occasionally, fishing nets bring up mammoth bones or ancient tools from the seafloor, physical evidence of the vanished world. Any archaeological sites that existed in the central portions of Beringia are now lost beneath the sea. The camps where people lived, the kill sites where they butchered animals, the tool manufacturing areas where they made stone points, all of it is underwater and inaccessible with current technology. This is why our understanding of the Beringia crossing is incomplete. Much of the evidence is gone. The flooding of Beringia completed the separation of human populations. People who had crossed into Alaska and moved south into the Americas were now on one side of an ocean. People who remained in Asia were on the other side. With no boats capable of crossing open ocean, no navigation technology for open water travel, the two groups were effectively isolated from each other. The land bridge that had opened during the Ice Age and allowed humans to populate two continents had closed. The separation was complete when the Bering Strait flooded and Beringia disappeared beneath the waves. Something extraordinary happened. Two branches of humanity became completely isolated from each other for the first time in modern human history. The people living in the Americas had no contact with the people living in Eurasia and Africa. Neither group knew the other existed. This separation lasted for approximately 10,000 years, from around 11,000 years ago, when the land bridge flooded, until 1492 AD, when Columbus reached the Caribbean. 10,000 years is a long time in human terms. It represents roughly 400 human generations. It's longer than all of recorded human history. The isolation was nearly complete. There was one exception that we know of. Norse Vikings reached North America around 1000 AD, establishing a short-lived settlement at Los O Meadows in Newfoundland. However, this contact lasted only a few years and had essentially no genetic or cultural impact. The Norse left, and the isolation continued. 10,000 years of separation may not seem significant on evolutionary timescales. Species typically take hundreds of thousands or millions of years to diverge into separate species. But 10,000 years of isolation is enough time for measurable genetic divergence to begin. The process of speciation had started even if it was far from complete. The founding population that entered the Americas was small, perhaps 200 to 500 individuals. This small population size had immediate genetic consequences. Human populations carried genetic variation, differences in DNA sequences between individuals. Larger populations have more variation. Smaller populations have less. The founding population carried only a subset of the genetic diversity present in Asian populations. This is called a genetic bottleneck or founder effect. Every generation after the bottleneck inherited this reduced diversity. New mutations arose over time, creating some new variation. But the overall genetic diversity of Native American populations remained lower than populations that didn't go through the bottleneck. Modern genetic studies can measure this diversity difference precisely. Native American populations show approximately 30% less genetic diversity than African populations, and approximately 20% less than European or Asian populations. This reduced diversity is a direct consequence of the small founding population and the subsequent isolation. The bottleneck shows up most clearly in uniparental markers, genetic sequences inherited only through one parent. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child. Y chromosomes pass from father to son. These markers don't recombine, so they preserve a clear record of ancestry. Non-Native American mitochondrial DNA belongs primarily to 5 haplogroups: A, B, C, D, and X. All 5 trace back to East Asian origins. The limited number of haplogroups compared to Asian populations reflects the bottleneck. Only a few maternal lineages made it across Beringia and gave rise to all subsequent Native Americans. Y chromosome analysis shows a similar pattern. Native American Y chromosomes belong to a limited number of haplogroups, primarily Q and C. These haplogroups are found in Asian populations as well, confirming the Asian origin. But again, the limited diversity reflects the small founding population. Beyond the immediate bottleneck effect, 10,000 years of isolation allowed genetic drift and selection to create further divergence. Genetic drift refers to random changes in gene frequencies that happen in all populations. In isolated populations, drift can cause significant changes over time, as some genetic variants become more common and others disappear. Natural selection also operated differently in the Americas than in Eurasia. Different environments create different selective pressures. Body proportions adapted to local climates. Populations in Arctic regions developed shorter, stockier builds that conserve heat better. Populations in tropical regions develop taller, leaner builds that dissipate heat more efficiently. Skin tone varied in response to ultraviolet radiation exposure. Populations at high latitudes with less intense sunlight could maintain lighter skin that produces vitamin D more efficiently in low-light conditions. Populations near the equator maintain darker skin that protects against UV damage. The most significant divergence involved disease resistance. The Americas and Eurasia developed completely different disease environments. This happened because of fundamental differences in how human populations lived in each hemisphere and what domesticated animals they had contact with. In Eurasia, humans had domesticated numerous large mammals: cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, horses, chickens. Living in close contact with these animals created opportunities for diseases to jump from animals to humans. Smallpox likely originated from cattle. Influenza came from pigs and birds. Measles descended from rinderpest, a cattle disease. Dense agricultural populations in Eurasia created ideal conditions for these diseases to spread and become established. Epidemic diseases require large populations to sustain transmission chains. In cities and agricultural regions, these diseases became endemic. The Americas had fewer domesticated animals. In North America, only dogs were domesticated. In South America, people domesticated llamas and alpacas, but these animals don't share as many diseases with humans as Old World livestock do. There were no cattle, no pigs, no horses, no chickens. Without the animal disease reservoir and without the dense agricultural populations, the major epidemic diseases never developed in the Americas. Native American populations had their own diseases, certainly, but not smallpox, measles, influenza, or the other killers that had become endemic in Eurasia. This created an immunity gap. On over thousands of years, Eurasian populations had been exposed to these diseases generation after generation. Natural selection favored individuals with genetic variants that provided some resistance. Populations evolved partial immunity, not complete protection, but enough that survival rates improved. Native American populations had no such exposure and no opportunity to evolve resistance. When Europeans arrived in 1492 and brought these diseases with them, Native Americans had no immunity whatsoever. The consequences were catastrophic. Disease killed an estimated 90% of the Native American population within the first century of contact. It was the greatest demographic disaster in recorded history, made possible by 10,000 years of separation and divergent disease evolution. The isolation had created two branches of humanity that had become different enough that simply bringing them back into contact had devastating consequences. During the 10,000 years of separation, something dramatic happened in the Americas. The megafauna that had dominated the landscape when humans first arrived began to disappear. By the time Europeans reached the Americas in 1492, most of the Ice Age giants were extinct. The world had fundamentally changed. The extinction list is staggering. Woolly mammoths vanished from mainland North America by around 10,000 years ago. A small population survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until approximately 4,000 years ago. But these were isolated remnants. Columbian mammoths, mastodons, and gomphotheres all went extinct around the same time. Horses disappeared entirely from the Americas. Multiple horse species that had lived across North and South America for millions of years were gone by 10,000 years ago. Horses wouldn't return to the Americas until Spanish conquistadors brought domesticated horses in the 1500s. The animals that Native Americans saw in 1492 would have seemed like alien creatures from another world. Camels vanished from their homeland. The camel family had originated in North America and lived there for tens of millions of years. The western camel and yesterday's camel, both common during the Ice Age, went extinct. Only the lineages that had migrated to Asia and eventually Africa survived, becoming the modern camels we know today. Giant ground sloths disappeared. These massive animals, some weighing 4 tons and standing 20 feet long, had been common across the Americas. Multiple species occupied different ecological niches from Alaska to Patagonia. By 10,000 years ago, they were gone. The short-faced bear, the most powerful predator North America had ever seen, went extinct around the same time. Dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, American lions, scimitar cats, and the American cheetah all disappeared. The predators that had kept herbivore populations in check were gone. The entire ecosystem structure that had existed for millions of years collapsed in a geological instant. What caused these extinctions? This question has generated intense scientific debate for decades. Two main hypotheses have emerged, and the evidence suggests both played a role. The first is climate change. The world was warming rapidly as the Ice Age ended. Habitats were transforming. Grasslands were becoming forests. The steppe tundra ecosystem was disappearing. However, climate change alone doesn't fully explain the extinctions. The Pleistocene epoch, the geological period that included the Ice Age, saw multiple glacial cycles. The climate had warmed and cooled repeatedly over the past 2 million years. Animals had survived previous warming periods. Why did they go extinct this time? The answer appears to be the presence of human hunters. The correlation between human arrival and megafauna extinction is striking and appears across different continents. In Australia, humans arrived about 50,000 years ago. Within 10,000 years, most Australian megafauna were extinct. In the Americas, humans arrived around 15,000 years ago. Most megafauna were extinct by 10,000 years ago. In Eurasia and Africa, where animals evolved alongside humans, more megafauna survived. The pattern suggests that animals which had never encountered humans were vulnerable to human hunting in ways that animals with evolutionary experience with humans were not. Megafauna in the Americas had no fear response to these upright apes with sharp sticks. They didn't run. They didn't have defensive behaviors. Combined with climate change that was already stressing their populations, hunting pressure from expanding human populations was enough to push them over the edge into extinction. The world the separated human populations inhabited was fundamentally different from the one their ancestors had known. The megafauna age was over. For 10,000 years, humanity existed as two separate branches. One branch lived in the Americas, that spread across two continents from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America. The other branch lived in Eurasia and Africa, occupying the rest of the world. Neither knew the other existed. They were separated by an ocean that had formed when the Ice Age ended, and a massive land bridge flooded beneath rising seas. This separation was made possible by climate. The Ice Age locked enough water in glaciers to drop sea levels 400 feet, exposing Beringia as dry land. Humans in Asia followed herds of animals across this land into Alaska, never knowing they were entering a new world. They were just hunting, just surviving, doing what their ancestors had always done. Then, the world warmed, the glaciers melted, the seas rose, Beringia flooded. The connection was severed. For 10,000 years, the two branches developed independently. Yet different diseases evolved, different adaptations emerged, genetic divergence began. We were on the path, however slowly, toward becoming two different species. The separation ended in 1492 when Columbus reached the Americas. Two branches of humanity that had been isolated for 400 generations suddenly reconnected. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Disease exchange killed 90% of Native Americans within a century. Genetic mixing began and continues today. We are now, once again, one interconnected species. This is the story of how climate opened a pathway between continents, how humans crossed it without understanding what they were doing, and how the closing of that pathway created the longest period of human isolation in our species' recent history. It's the story of Beringia, the crossing, and the 10,000-year separation that shaped who we became.